You look like a piece of street trash someone forgot to sweep away. Give me my broom back, please. You belong in the dirt, wiping up our messes. God made people like you to serve people like me.
You look like a piece of street trash someone forgot to sweep away. James Sterling did not even look up from his phone when he said it. The snoop-nosed 43-year-old senior managing partner of Sterling and Associates didn't care that the grand ballroom on the 54th floor of One Liberty Plaza was packed with 62 of the city's most prominent corporate lawyers, judges, and federal prosecutors. He didn't care that the air tasted like expensive champagne and imported caviar. All he cared about was the fact that a dark-skinned elderly janitor, wearing a faded blue uniform with the name tag Arthur stitched over the pocket, had accidentally bumped against his table with a cleaning cart. The slight vibration had caused a single drop of red wine to spill onto the pristine linen tablecloth, and to James Sterling, that was an unpardonable sin. Then James did something that made the entire room freeze. He reached out, grabbed Arthur's worn wooden broom, and snapped it clean over his knee with a sharp, echoing crack that sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. Arthur Miller didn't flinch. He stood there, 61 years old, his back slightly curved from a lifetime of hard labor, his calloused hands resting flat at his sides. His breathing remained perfectly rhythmic, unbothered by the sudden display of violence. "Give me my broom back, please," Arthur said. His voice was quiet, steady, carrying a thick, unmistakable accent from Central America, each word deliberate and measured. James laughed, a high, mocking sound that rattled against the crystal chandeliers. He kicked the broken pieces across the floor. "Or what, Arthur? You going to feel your way out of this building? You going to complain to the labor board? Look at yourself. You can barely string a proper sentence together in English without choking on your own ignorance. You belong in the dirt, wiping up our messes. God made people like you to serve people like me. You are twice worthless, blind to your own place in this world, and completely expendable to this firm." To ensure the humiliation was total, James tipped his heavy crystal tumbler, pouring exactly $500 worth of rare, single malt Scotch directly onto Arthur's scuffed leather shoes. The golden liquid soaked into the worn material, splashing against the hem of his cleaning uniform. 62 people watched. Federal judges who spent their days lecturing classrooms at Columbia University about the sacred nature of constitutional rights, corporate executives who signed public diversity pledges every fiscal quarter, high society wives wrapped in thousands of dollars of imported silk dresses. Not one person moved, not one person said a single word to stop it. They just looked away, suddenly very interested in their heavy gold watches, their expensive drinks, or the sweeping view of the midnight Manhattan skyline outside the glass. The silence was absolute, heavy with the hen-hot of the elite. Arthur stood perfectly still in that puddle of liquor for exactly 3 seconds. He didn't yell. He didn't reach for James's expensive, custom-tailored Italian suit. He simply knelt down on the cold, cum-thack floor, picked up both shattered pieces of the wooden handle with steady hands, and stood back up. His eyes, clear and incredibly sharp behind a pair of cheap, wire-rimmed reading glasses, locked directly onto James's arrogant face. There was no fear in those eyes, only the cold, calculating precision of a man recording a crime scene. Because what happened next over the following 72 hours would make James Sterling and every single person in that grand ballroom wish they had never turned their backs on the old man with the broom. They would carry the terrifying proof of their silence for the rest of their natural lives. James Sterling believed he had just put a worthless immigrant janitor in his place, completely unaware that his cruel words had just been transmitted directly to a federal surveillance van parked 3 blocks away on Broadway. He had no idea that the broken broom was not an administrative tool. but a calculated prop in a high-stakes psychological game. And James Sterling was about to learn that some secrets are buried so deep that when they finally surface, they don't just ruin reputations, they destroy empires. The clock was already ticking toward 11:45 p.m., the exact moment the trap would spring. Let's rewind. Exactly 12 hours before that glass of scotch hit the floor, and Arthur Miller was forced to stand in a puddle of humiliation, his day began precisely at 4:45 in the morning. In a cramped, immaculate one-bedroom apartment in the heart of Jackson Heights, Queens, Arthur woke up without an alarm clock. The apartment smelled faintly of dark roast coffee and fresh corn tortillas. He spent his first 20 minutes of the day in absolute silence, sitting on the edge of his bed, executing a series of controlled breathing exercises designed to lower his heart rate and clear his mind. He looked at a small, silver-framed photograph on his nightstand. A picture of a grand mahogany courtroom from a life that felt like a century ago. To his neighbors in the building, Arthur was a ghost. A quiet, polite elderly man who spoke broken English, carried a plastic grocery bag to the subway every morning, and returned late at night with a tired smile. They thought he was just another anonymous face in the sea of New York's working class, someone you nod at in the hallway and completely forget about by the time you reached the street. That was the entire point. The identity of Arthur Miller, the humble janitor, was a masterpiece of deception. Arthur Miller had never been a janitor. His real name was Mateo Villanueva. 30 years ago, he was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of El Salvador. He was a man who had written constitutional amendments, a man who had stared down international drug cartels, corrupt generals, and billionaire politicians who thought they were untouchable. He had survived 3 assassination attempts, including a car bomb that left a faint, jagged scar running from his left collarbone down to his rib cage. When the corruption finally collapsed the justice system in his homeland, the federal government of the United States had quietly extracted him under a top-secret political asylum program. He didn't need the money from sweeping floors at One Liberty Plaza. He didn't need the abuse. But for the past 14 months, he had volunteered for a specialized assignment with the Eastern District of New York's Federal Anti-Corruption Task Force. The task force had been trying to crack an invisible, massive financial crime syndicate operating out of Wall Street for over 5 years. On paper, Sterling and Associates was a high-end corporate law firm specializing in international mergers and maritime law. Underneath the mahogany desks and oil paintings, it was a colossal clearinghouse for illegal capital. James Sterling was the architect. He had created a complex, multi-layered system of shell companies based in Delaware and the Cayman Islands that allowed foreign oligarchs and corrupt politicians to buy up high-end Manhattan real estate using washed cash. Over 6 years, James had facilitated the illegal transfer of exactly $42,175,000, driving up property values, displacing thousands of low-income families in the outer boroughs and bribing city housing inspectors to approve fraudulent luxury developments. The FBI couldn't get a wiretap approved because James was too smart. He never used digital communications for the core deals. He only spoke in person, in the secure, sweeping offices of his penthouse suite on the 54th floor. So Mateo Villanueva became Arthur the janitor. He spent 6 grueling months practicing the cover story. He trained himself to slouch, to lower his gaze, to pretend he couldn't understand complex legal jargon when it was shouted right next to him. He learned to speak English with a heavy, clumsy impediment, intentionally mispronouncing basic words to make himself appear uneducated and non-threatening. Every night for over a year, Arthur pushed a heavy cleaning cart through the executive suites of Sterling and Associates. While James's partners treated him like a piece of living furniture, Arthur was analyzing everything. His eyes, trained by 40 years of legal warfare, memorized the positions of sensitive documents left on desks. He noticed which folders were locked in the credenzas, which shredder bins were emptied on Tuesdays, and exactly what time the security guards changed shifts. His handler, a senior federal agent named Thomas Vance, communicated with him through a specialized micro-receiver hidden inside a cheap, flesh-colored hearing aid Arthur wore in his left ear. Every morning at 8 sharp, Arthur would check in. Every night at 2 in the morning, he would download the data he had observed onto an encrypted laptop in his Queens apartment. He was building an airtight case, brick by brick. But federal prosecutions require absolute proof of intent, and James Sterling was a master of plausible compounds deniability. To get the final piece of evidence, the master ledger containing the real names behind the Cayman accounts. Arthur had to get close to James's personal safe, and to do that without raising suspicion, he had to become completely invisible. He had to let them think he was utterly powerless. For 14 months, Arthur endured a slow, systematic grinding down of his human dignity. He stood there silently while junior associates used his trash bin as a basketball hoop, laughing when coffee grounds spilled across the clean carpet he had spent an hour vacuuming. He didn't say a word when James intentionally dropped a heavy stack of legal briefs onto his foot, pretending it was an accident. The hardest part wasn't the physical exhaustion. It was the burning in his chest, the rage of a man who had spent his life upholding the law, forced to bow his head to criminals who wore $3,000 Brioni suits. His only real friend in the building was Sarah Jenkins, a 26-year-old evening receptionist who worked the front desk. Sarah was a college student from Brooklyn, working 2 jobs to pay her tuition at City College. She didn't know about the task force. She just saw Arthur as a sweet, grandfatherly figure who always brought her an extra pastry from the bakery near the subway station. Sarah was fierce, protective, and had a habit of documenting everything on her phone for her social media accounts, recording the late-night beauty of the empty skyscrapers. Arthur constantly had to remind her to put the phone away, gentle but firm, knowing that one stray frame could compromise a multi-year federal operation. By the first week of June, the tension inside One Liberty Plaza was reaching a breaking point. The firm was preparing for its annual gala, a massive public relations event meant to celebrate their victory in a landmark corporate restructuring case. A case that Arthur knew was actually a massive front for a hostile, illegal takeover of a historic housing complex in Queens. Arthur's handler gave him a hard deadline. The task force was running out of budget, and James was preparing to transfer the ledger to a private bank in Zurich by the end of the month. "You have 2 weeks, Arthur," Thomas Vance had told him through the earpiece during a midnight shift. "If you don't get the ledger by then, we pull you out. The risk is becoming too high." 2 weeks, and James Sterling was becoming more volatile, more arrogant, and more dangerous with every passing hour. He had no idea his janitor was reading his financial maps in the dark. The brewing storm did not take long to return to the present moment, dragging the narrative back to the suffocating luxury of the 54th floor. The golden Scotch was still soaking into Arthur's shoes. James Sterling stepped closer, his chest puffed out with a self-righteous fury that made him believe he was simply maintaining the proper standards of his high society environment. He did not like the way the old man was looking at him through those cheap, wire-rimmed glasses. There was no submission in Arthur's eyes, no trembling, no tears. To a man like James, who bought and sold human lives for a living, that lack of fear was an insult. "Call security," James barked, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the ballroom. "I want this illegal street rat thrown out of my building immediately." "And call the police." He looked around the room, gathering the silent approval of his colleagues. "This man intentionally damaged my property, threatened me, and he is clearly working here without proper legal status. I want him detained." Within 90 seconds, two burly private security guards in dark suits moved through the crowd. They were James's personal hires, men who asked no questions and followed every order to protect the firm's secrets. They grabbed Arthur by his upper arms, their fingers digging deep into his flesh. They twisted his arms behind his back, forcing the broken pieces of the broom to clatter to the marble floor once again. James leaned in so close Arthur could smell the expensive tobacco and high-end liquor on his breath. "You think you can just walk into a place like this and look at me like an equal?" James whispered, his voice dripping with venom. "Clean the floor with your shirt, Arthur. Get down on your knees and wipe up my scotch, or I will personally ensure you spend the rest of your miserable life in a federal detention center before you get thrown back to whatever third-world gutter you crawled out of." The crowd remained frozen. Sarah Jenkins, standing near the back exit, felt her blood run cold. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold her phone, but she kept it low, hidden behind a large floral arrangement, recording every single second of the interaction. She knew this was wrong. She knew Arthur was a good man. But the weight of 60 corporate lawyers and federal prosecutors standing in silent compliance was a wall that no ordinary receptionist could breach. The systemic silence of the room was absolute. Inside Arthur's left ear, the micro-receiver buzzed. Thomas Vance's voice came through, sharp, urgent, and tense. "Hold your position, Mateo," the handler whispered from the surveillance van down on Broadway. "Do not resist. The tactical team is already moving into the building's secondary security hub. We are intercepts of their internal network right now. Let them commit to the violation. Let the system run its course. Every word he says is another year in a maximum security cell. Hold on." Arthur did not fight back. He possessed the physical training to break the grip of both security guards in less than 2 seconds, a legacy of his early days coordinating judicial security forces against guerrilla cartels. He could have driven his heel into the kneecap of the guard on his right, leveraged his weight to fracture the wrist of the guard on his left, and left James Sterling gasping on the floor before the crowd could even blink. But he didn't move a single muscle in resistance. He chose a deeper, more absolute form of power. He chose the absolute dignity of a man who knew the law was a machine that, once set in motion, would grind his oppressor into dust. "I will not clean the floor with my shirt, Mr. Sterling," Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave, losing a fraction of its forced, clumsy accent. The words were perfectly clear, delivered with a calm, rhythmic precision that made a few junior associates near the front row look up in sudden confusion. "You have broken my tools. You have spilled your drink. The police will arrive, and we will see who truly belongs in a cell tonight." James sneered, completely missing the shift in the old man's tone. His arrogance was a shield that blinded him to reality. "Lock him in the holding room downstairs," James ordered the guards. "Don't let him leave until Officer Henderson gets here. We are going to make an example out of this trash." The guards dragged Arthur backward out of the grand ballroom, his shoes leaving a faint trail of wet scotch on the polished Calacatta cum thack. James turned back to his guests, raising his glass with a wide, victorious smile. "Now, where were we? Let's toast to the Southside luxury housing acquisition, a deal that will redefine the skyline of this city by Friday morning." The crowd cheered, the crystal glasses clinked, and the music swelled back to life, burying the memory of the janitor beneath a wave of corporate noise. They believed the unpleasantness was over. They had no idea that the storm had just broken anchor, and it was heading straight for the top floor. The layers of reveal began exactly 48 minutes later inside the private executive boardroom, adjacent to James Sterling's penthouse office. Arthur was not sitting in a holding cell. He was standing by the panoramic window, his wire-rimmed glasses tucked into his pocket, his back perfectly straight as he watched the blinking lights of the city below. The two private security guards who had dragged him out were now leaning against the wall, their weapons removed, their hands bound with heavy-duty federal zip ties. Standing over them were three men in dark tactical jackets, with the letters FBI emblazoned across the back. The heavy mahogany doors swung open. James Sterling walked in, flanked by Officer Henderson, a local precinct cop who had been on James's payroll for 42 months, receiving exactly $3,500 in cash envelopes every first Tuesday of the month. James was still holding his half-empty glass Oshach, his face flushed with the victory of his gala.
"What the hell is this?"
James shouted, his voice cracking as he saw his personal guards restrained on the floor. "Officer Henderson, arrest these men.
"They are trespassing on private corporate property."
Officer Henderson reached for his holster, but he froze before Fuiserters could touch the leather. Senior Special Agent Thomas Vance stepped out from the shadows near the corner safe, holding a folder wrapped in thick blue tape.
He didn't look at the local cop. He looked directly at James Sterling.
"Officer Henderson," Thomas Vance said, his voice flat, carry an icy federal authority.
"If you touch that weapon,
you will be violating Section 24(2) a title of Title 18 of the United States Code under color of law. You are currently standing in a federal crime scene, and your presence in the Cayman Island transactions of Peachtree Holdings has already been logged."
Step back.
Henderson's face drained of color. His hand dropped to his side like a lead weight. He took 3 slow steps backward until his spine hit the doorframe. James Sterling laughed, though the sound was hollow, a desperate attempt to maintain his self-righteous armor.
"This is ridiculous. Vance, right?"
"I know your regional director. I had dinner with him at the Yale Club 3 weeks ago. You have absolutely nothing. My firm handles legitimate international trade. You can't touch my files without a federal warrant signed by a district judge."
"A federal warrant like this one?"
The voice came from the head of the boardroom table. James turned, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the old janitor.
But Arthur was no longer slouching.
He moved with a slow, commanding grace that made the entire room feel smaller. He reached into his blue uniform jacket, pulled out a laminated federal credential, and laid it flat on the glass table. "Special Agent Mateo Villanueva, Civil Rights and Anti-Corruption Division." Arthur said. His English was suddenly flawless, delivered with the deep, resonant timbre of a man who had spent 20 years delivering verdicts from the highest bench in Central America. "And this warrant was signed precisely at 9:15 this morning by Chief Judge Evelyn Carter of the Eastern District of New York." James stared at the credential, then at Arthur's face. His hands began to tremble, the Scotch sloshing against the rim of his crystal glass. You're the janitor. You don't even know how to write an incident report. You're an illegal street rat."
"I have your employment file downstairs."
"Your employment file was created by our Technical Operations Unit." 14 months ago, James," Arthur said, stepping closer until he was standing less than 2 feet away from the man who had poured liquor on his shoes less than an hour before. "Every time you left your desk to attend your 3-hour lunches at Delmonico's, I wasn't just vacuuming your carpet. I was downloading the encrypted sector drives from your private server. Every time you spoke to your partners about the Southside Luxury acquisition, the deal that displaced exactly 114 low-income immigrant families from their rent-controlled apartments in Queens, you were speaking directly into a dual-frequency microphone embedded inside the wooden handle of my broom." Arthur reached down, picked up the 2 broken pieces of the broom from the floor, and twisted the plastic cap at the top of the handle. A small blue LED light blinked 3 times before going solid. The look of absolute panic that crossed James Sterling's face was a masterpiece of crushing karma. The self-righteous corporate god was dissolving into a terrified white-collar criminal. He dropped his glass. It shattered against the floor, the remaining Scotch mixing with the shards of crystal, mimicking the scene from the ballroom.
This is a setup,
James screamed, turning toward Officer Henderson, then toward his restrained guards. It's a fabrication, my lawyer. Call Richard Foster. He'll have this thrown out before breakfast. Richard Foster is currently being detained at John F. Kennedy International Airport. Thomas Vance interrupted, sliding a sheet of paper across the table. His private Gulfstream was grounded 40 minutes ago by federal marshals. He was carrying 2 aluminum briefcases containing exactly $6,412,000 in unmarked bearer bonds. He's already signing a cooperation agreement, James. He gave us the master ledger. He gave us the names of the Delaware shell companies.
he gave us you.
2 federal agents moved behind James Sterling. The metallic click of the handcuffs open and closing echoed through the silent boardroom.
James didn't fight.
His legs seemed to turn to water. He collapsed into one of the leather executive chairs, his head falling forward into his hands, his entire body shaking as the realization of his complete ruin washed over him. The empire he had built on the backs of the poor, the families he had destroyed because of their color and their language, had been dismantled by an old man with a broken broom. Arthur looked down at him for a final 3 seconds. He didn't gloat. He didn't strike him. He simply adjusted his glasses, turned his back on the broken billionaire, and walked out into the corridor where the tactical teams were already sweeping the remaining executives into custody. 6 months after the crystal shattered on the 54th floor of One Liberty Plaza, the silence that once filled the building had completely transformed. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of fear and systemic oppression. It was the quiet, industrious peace of restoration. The federal court ordered absolute restitution for every single one of the 114 low-income immigrant families that James Sterling's financial syndicate had ruthlessly displaced. The historic housing complex in Queens, once destined to be demolished and flipped into multi-million-dollar luxury penthouses using washed offshore cash, was quietly returned to the community. The families began moving back in just as the winter snow began to melt, bringing life, laughter, and the rich, diverse rhythms of their native languages back to the courtyards. James Sterling was convicted on all federal counts, including racketeering, wire fraud, and conspiracy to violate civil rights. He was sentenced to exactly 18 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The self-righteous corporate god, who once believed he was born to rule over others, was stripped of his custom suits, his assets, and his prestigious title. In his final moments in the courtroom, before being led away in cheap canvas prison garb, he looked at Arthur, now sitting at the prosecution table in a sharp federal blazer, and finally bowed his head in a silent, agonizing realization of his own complete moral failure. Officer Henderson received 12 years for his corruption, and Richard Foster, the high-priced attorney who thought he could hide behind corporate walls, was barred from practicing law for life and handed an 8-year sentence. Sarah Jenkins, the young evening receptionist, who had the courage to keep her phone recording behind the floral arrangement, became the operational backbone of a new movement. Using the evidence gathered during the 14-month sting operation, she and Special Agent Mateo Villanueva co-founded the Villanueva-Jenkins Project, a heavily funded nonprofit dedicated to legal outreach and fighting systemic housing discrimination across New York City. The office received a massive federal grant, allowing them to provide free, top-tier legal representation to thousands of working-class families who had previously been ignored by the system. Mateo Villanueva returned to Washington, D.C., his mission in New York successfully completed. He stood in the grand auditorium of the FBI headquarters, where the broken pieces of his wooden cleaning broom had been carefully reassembled and placed inside a bulletproof glass display case. Beneath the glass, a small brass plaque read, "Carried by Special Agent Mateo Villanueva, Manhattan, New York." disguised as weakness, used as strength. He didn't wear dark glasses or slouch anymore. He stood tall, a man who had faced the worst of human arrogance and proved that dignity is an unbreakable shield. Dignity is not something anyone can take from you, Mateo said in his final briefing to a new class of federal recruits at Quantico. They can pour their drinks on your shoes, they can snap your tools, and they can try to make you feel invisible because of your accent or the color of your skin. But the law is an unyielding machine. When you stand still, when you let the system work, the truth will always grind them into dust. Power does not belong to the loudest voice in the room. It belongs to the one who watches, remembers, and refuses to bend. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever sat in a room where someone was being mistreated and felt the heavy weight of the crowd's silence pressing against you? If you were one of those 62 prominent guests watching the old man on his knees, would you have kept your eyes on your drink, or would you have been the one to step forward? There is a tiny, easily missed detail in the first 2 minutes of this story, a specific phrase James Sterling used that directly foretold his own downfall. Go back, rewatch that moment carefully, and tell me in the comments if you can spot the hidden Easter egg. If this story ignited a spark of hope or filled you with a righteous anger against systemic injustice, please share it with someone who needs to remember their own worth today. Hit the subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, and leave your thoughts below. The next story we uncover might change the way you look at the world forever. Your worth is never defined by how they treat you, only by how you rise,